So thank you very much for having me today. And I enjoyed that talk just now as well. My name is Lauri Kytömaa, or this is a European audience, or you can call me Lauri Kytömaa as well, if you can speak Finnish for some reason. Um, and I'm a final year student at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm actually going to be joining the Applied Economics and Policy group at Cornell's College of Business in the fall as a faculty member. So I hope to continue pushing this work on. So I'm happy to take any comments to hand. So today I'm going to be talking about my job market paper, which focuses on residential mortgage foreclosure, which is the process by which a financial institution takes a property away from a borrower that was unable to make their regularly obligated debt payments. Okay, so the first bit of context to keep in mind as we talk through this project is that foreclosure is really costly for all the market participants directly involved in the process. So setting aside third parties and externalities for now. The borrowers are forced out of their home. They're severely hampered in credit markets. And papers outside of economics have also tied the event of foreclosure to increased rates of depression, divorce, and even suicide. On the financial institution side, or the debt holder side, debt holders are losing meaningfully through this process as well, at least in the United States, because these properties are sold rapidly through foreclosure auctions. The institutions controlling the properties don't try to time the market or something and wait till property prices recover, and so they take a pretty substantial loss relative to market value of those properties. Coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, the losses were in the order of 40% of the principal outstanding on the debt. So these were really significant. Okay, so a question this opens up, and a question that has been asked by authors before, prominently by Adelino, Girardi, and authors, is why can't these two parties, if they're suffering through this direct interaction, why can't they reach some kind of mutually beneficial agreement where maybe we grant some debt relief to the borrower through debt forgiveness? Say they have to pay 10, 15% less on their debt. Now it's more affordable. And the debt holders and the financial institutions are going to be taking smaller losses than they would through the foreclosure process. Okay, so that's kind of the central focus of this project as well, but I'm going to be looking at a new set of channels together that can explain this story. So the central research question here is, what is preventing banks or mortgage servicers, these are the entities that generally deal with the borrowers, from granting debt relief to struggling borrowers? Okay, I'm going to be focusing on this set of channels in this project. So first and most prominently, or the biggest contribution here, is going to be thinking explicitly about the information asymmetry problem that exists between borrowers and their financial institutions. So to be clear, I'm really focused on the fact that borrowers are holding private information about their financial health that institutions can't reasonably learn. Okay, so for example, you may have access to informal credit markets from your friends, family, or social groups, and that would not show up in any conventional mortgage servicing data. What this is going to do is it's going to create scope for some borrowers to pretend as if they're distressed, if the relief is meaningfully, if it's generous enough. Okay, so anyone would like 20% off on their mortgage, even if they can afford the original mortgage. Financial institutions are going to internalize the fact that there is a risk of strategic behavior by borrowers, even if it's very small, and become more hesitant than they would compared to a full information environment where they know exactly who needs assistance and who doesn't. Okay, and this information asymmetry is also going to capture kind of reputational concerns. Okay, if we don't know who to give it to and we look like we're lenient, then we're going to create an even more adversely selected pool if we seem generous to borrowers. Okay, the two other channels here that are actually going to be more policy relevant, and I'll describe that a little bit, is first, we may also think about transaction costs. So maybe granting relief is actually not worthwhile because it costs a lot to hire people to screen borrowers and change the contractual terms and things like that. But beyond just hiring someone, I'm also thinking more broadly about economic costs around, there may be legal costs here. So some of these mortgage-backed security pooling agreements actually restricted mortgage servicers from being able to modify the terms of the contract with borrowers to grant them relief. Okay, that's something that's been studied by other authors. But we may also have these servicers facing really meaningful capacity constraints. Maybe they just weren't able to ramp up support for borrowers, especially coming out of the financial crisis. Okay, transaction cost is policy relevant because maybe we could be subsidizing institutions to offset some of these costs. And that's something that was going on during this time, coming out of the financial crisis. Okay, and then relief sufficiency is perhaps the most obvious. Maybe the borrower needs so much relief, it's just not worth giving it to them. If they need 90% off their mortgage, as the debt holder, I prefer to take the foreclosure loss than basically give a free mortgage to a borrower. Okay, so I'm going to be building a structural model that incorporates all of these channels. So what this paper does is introduce a structural model of foreclosure prevention, in which banks are going to be setting a relief policy in an environment where they can't perfectly observe borrower types. Borrowers are going to be aware of this relief policy and make repayment decisions, or end up in foreclosure if they stop making payments on their debt. Important for identification, I'm not going to have a lot of time to get through this today in today's format, but I'm going to allow banks to face heterogeneous costs of relief. I'm not forcing them to be different. I'm just allowing them to be different to capture the fact that different financial institutions, a Bank of America versus a Wells Fargo, treated borrowers very differently during this time. And some of that is coming from institutional side rather than borrower characteristics. And I'm happy to take questions about that later on. I'm going to be estimating this model using California mortgages originated prior to 2008. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a few slides. But essentially, I'm going to be leveraging really rich loan level performance data from Fannie Mae, and this is going to be actually prime market mortgages, not subprime market mortgages. Part of this reason, the mechanisms I highlighted on the previous slide are going to be cleaner to explore in a prime setting, where we didn't maybe have as much fraud and documentation around borrowers was better. Okay, I'm going to be estimating this model, matching outcome probabilities with those implied by matching them to the data using simulated maximum likelihood. And finally, I'm going to take this machinery to study the Home Affordable Modification Program, or HAMP, which was the single largest federal program rolled out in the United States to combat mortgage foreclosure. Okay, I'm going to be able to quantify the role of government incentive payments. Did they actually shift outcomes? And I'm going to be able to assess the level of relief generosity under this program. Okay, quickly, again, I don't have a ton of time for background, but I want to give you an example of what this debt relief looked like. So I guess for the rest of this presentation, I'll be talking about loan modifications, and that's going to be the same thing as debt relief in this under this HAMP program. So loan modification is essentially a very generous refinancing. That's the best way to think about it. So when we get a refinance, we have three levers that can be pulled on our contractual terms. We can change the interest rate, we can change the term in years, or we can change the principal balance. Changing any of these will translate to changes in the monthly payments and some net present value for the bank or the creditor. Okay, so in this example that I pulled from my data and rounded a little bit, because this is just for exposition or explanation of this program, is here the interest rate is actually cut in half, which is very generous. And then the term in years is kept fixed. Principal goes up a little bit just because the institutions generally tack on the payments you've missed onto the principal so you can pay that back over time. Okay, so this halving of the interest rate translates to a reduction in the monthly payments of $300 per month. So this is something that you would want even if you could afford the original mortgage. This is just money, free money, essentially. And this translates to a pretty significant loss for the creditor. But again, a 24% loss that I have here is not being compared to 0%. It's being compared to maybe 40, 50% loss through the foreclosure process. Okay, the government was aware when they were designing this HAMP program that banks were taking some losses through this process. So they offered a mix of upfront and ongoing incentive payments to banks to incentivize them to grant this assistance to borrowers. Okay. So at the center of this project is going to be this policy setting game between now the banks, or I'm going to be calling them mortgage servicers because that's explicitly who's dealing with borrowers, and the borrowers. Okay, I'm going to collapse this interaction of should we grant debt relief to the borrower and is the borrower repaying into a three-stage game that I depict on this slide. Now we could imagine you could, for pure realism, model this as a fully dynamic game where every single month we're making a decision. Should I stop paying or not? Should I enter foreclosure or not? Should I grant relief as the institution every month? Okay, but collapsing it into this three-stage game is going to buy me a lot of tractability to explore the information asymmetry problem that is the focus here. Moreover, foreclosure is a one-shot thing. If we have data on consumer purchasing patterns, we can see you bought butter every month. We can't see that you entered foreclosure all the time and came out of foreclosure. It's a one-shot thing. And so adding a ton of dynamics doesn't add a lot of information to the information story that I'm exploring here. Moreover, this is a little bit of a case study of the financial crisis. And in my data, almost all the borrowers entered default or delinquency in certain windows. And so if they clear those windows, they are very likely to survive. And so that maps into this kind of stage structure. Okay, so in this game, the mortgage servicer is going to commit to a probability of granting you debt relief that's conditional on X's, your income, your credit score, and a distribution of unobservables. Okay, and I'll talk briefly about what those are. But so it doesn't know everything about you, but it knows a lot. It knows where your home is, it knows the value of the home, and it sets a probability of granting you aid. The borrower observes their own private information and observes the probability of getting relief. Okay, so I make $10 million a year, I'm probably not going to get assistance. Then the first decision is going to be the borrower's. Do I go delinquent or not? Okay, for me, delinquency is you miss 3 or more months of payments. Okay, that's my definition. Definitions are a little bit inconsistent in this literature. But so if you never go delinquent, this game ends, you repay your mortgage, and you get some utility associated with that repayment. If you do enter delinquency, now you realize this outcome of relief giving or this modification. With probability M, you get it, and with 1 minus M, you don't get it. Irrespective of what happens with debt relief, you have to make a default decision, or do I continue making payments? Okay, in practice, if a borrower in the data has not made payments for, I think 7 or 8 months, the probability of entering foreclosure approaches kind of 100%. Okay, so if you enter temporary delinquency, you've missed some payments, and this is fairly significant delinquency as well, my definition, 3 months. And then you stop making payments, you're going to be entering for default and foreclosure are synonymous in this model. Okay, so if you default, the servicer gets a foreclosure payout. And if you don't default, then the payout to the servicer depends on the modification outcome. So they get this P tilde if they're modified, and a P, which is equivalent to the no delinquency payment if they weren't modified. Transaction costs feature here whenever a modification occurs. I have this minus C. So if an institution knows the borrower is going to enter default with certainty, they would prefer always to not modify to avoid this minus C. Okay, because I don't have time to go through the full utility specification, I'll just also highlight here where I'm going to be allowing for private information and borrower idiosyncratic heterogeneity is both in the willingness to enter delinquency temporarily and in the willingness to enter default. Okay, so if you want to take on a car loan soon, the cost of delinquency on your credit score is going to be more meaningful to you than someone else. Okay, and then for default, maybe you have a family that's going to be really painful for you to move away from with. They're going to have to leave your kids are going to have to leave the school system, so forth. You may care more about foreclosure than someone who's maybe has good outside options for housing, even though it's painful for everyone. Okay, so quickly again, I'm using Fannie Mae fixed rate mortgages. I'm focusing on California because there are such big differences across states in how foreclosure is treated in terms of the timelines, whether or not it's recourse or not. California offers the single largest sample within state boundaries. But of course, it's not completely representative. You can't take the results of my paper and just multiply the numbers by Massachusetts. The story is going to be different in different states. And that's something I'm working on in kind of extension papers. I alluded to the fact that when we're looking at loans originated between 2004, 2007, that's to rule out this belief borrowers could have that they'll get assistance. Okay, so prior to 2009, when HAMP was really rolled out, this sort of generous assistance where you actually get meaningful discounts on your debt did not really exist. So it would not have been reasonable for borrowers to expect to get some kind of meaningful discount on their debt to avoid foreclosure. So I'm kind of in selecting the sample to try to get around a bit of a moral hazard problem on the borrower side, where they may behave differently because they expect kind of government intervention. Okay, so this is a loan level panel. I'm able to follow on a monthly basis the loan characteristics, so principal, interest rate, term remaining. Did you repay that month? And I have really rich borrower characteristics at origination. So I know the income, I know the credit score, I know everything about the property and its location. I don't know everything about the property, but I know its location and I know its value and things like that. Okay, and then I have really detailed foreclosure outcomes, including the proceeds and costs associated with foreclosure. And looking back at this crisis from 2023, I actually faced much less outcome censoring than papers written in 2010 about the crisis, because some of these foreclosures were still happening in 2014, 2015. Okay, it's a very long kind of winded process. Okay, so I estimate this model using simulated maximum likelihood. So I'm going to have to put some parametric assumptions on the unobservables that I haven't clearly specified for you guys today. And I'm going to form the probabilities of each of these 5 outcomes that come from the model. Okay, so I'm going to form the likelihood function, which is taking all the observables, 1 through n, and all the outcomes, 1 through 5. Okay, I'm going to search for the set of model parameters, this capital theta, that gets me as close, the model as close to the data as I can. Okay, and again, simulation is involved because I have unobservables that I cannot see. So I put structure on those and I simulate draws from those distributions. Okay, so what I want to close with is to show you kind of what is the purpose of this exercise. What can it actually help with? And I've said it could be policy relevant. Kind of why could it be policy relevant? So I'm going to close with this kind of matrix, which is I'm going to start by showing you just observed outcomes for delinquent loans. Again, so these are loans that have already missed 3 months of payments or more. And in this matrix, I have whether or not they ended up in foreclosure and whether or not they received relief through this kind of HAMP relief program. Okay, so we can see people ended up in all of these cells. And the cell names are consistent with kind of work by Adelino and Girardi. But so at the top left, for example, this person they entered delinquency, they did not receive aid, but they still avoided foreclosure. They actually started repaying their debt back. Okay, again, this is just data. Okay, the first thing to observe is at the top left and the bottom right, we have these kind of extreme types. Okay, so the person who didn't receive aid and avoided foreclosure is kind of this never defaulting type in the sense that we can imagine all else equal, if we gave them relief, we made the situation better for them, they would have also avoided foreclosure. Okay, and at the bottom right, this redefault type, they got relief, they had the best outcome in terms of assistance, but they still ended in foreclosure. Okay, so there's always defaulting type. So again, the exercise there is, what if we took away their relief and held everything else constant? Now they have less money, so we would imagine that they would enter foreclosure as well. Where the model starts to have some power is actually at the top right and bottom left cells. Okay, so I'm able to start parsing a third borrower type from these 2 extreme types. So at the top, we have borrowers who received assistance and avoided foreclosure. This is actually going to be a mix of 2 borrower types. One is one that actually truly needs aid to avoid foreclosure. So if this borrower does not receive assistance, they enter foreclosure. And so in a perfect information environment, we would want to give all the aid we can to them from a private perspective on the debt holder side and from a social perspective because foreclosure is costly. But in this cell, we also have some people who are this never defaulting type. So again, if we counterfactually took away their assistance, they would have actually ended up in this self-cure cell. So we actually didn't necessarily want to help this person from a kind of societal perspective. At the bottom left, we have some borrowers that actually needed the help and didn't get it. So we also missed some people. But the vast majority, I mean, these numbers suggest, the point here isn't to remember all the numbers, but these suggest the banks are doing a fairly good job too. They're not missing that many of the borrowers, and the vast majority of people who receive assistance actually needed it in this top left cell. But so really, and I haven't talked about identification, but where identification part of it's coming from is really these ex post outcomes. So we could talk about, okay, it's correct essentially ex post to award relief only when foreclosure is preventable. So we shouldn't give the relief if we fail to change the foreclosure outcome. Okay, then we're making mistakes when we reward relief to borrowers that don't the foreclosure outcome doesn't change, or we miss this needs aid borrower who truly would benefit from the assistance. Now, this exercise could be achieved through kind of an IV approach, where we have an instrument moving around modification that's unrelated to borrower characteristics. But really the power of this project is to talk about the mechanisms causing the percentages in this matrix. So, for example, the information, if we continue to improve information, the mistakes are going to decline on both. The first mistake type is we fail to grant relief to someone who needs it. And the second mistake type is we give relief to the borrowers who don't need it. Okay, and these have a flavor of type 1 and type 2 errors from kind of statistics that we're all familiar with. The other thing is if we begin to subsidize institutions, but we don't improve information, we're trading off mistakes. We're saying we're going to make more kind of giving mistakes, incorrect allocation relief mistakes, and we're going to reduce these mistakes where we miss the guys who need the aid. But if the information problem is large enough, kind of subsidizing institutions is pretty wasteful, essentially, and that's something that I show in the paper. Okay, so I'm pretty close to time, so I'll wrap up here, but I think this project has really highlighted to me that debt relief can be a really powerful tool for preventing foreclosure, but its effectiveness is going to rely on a number of different factors. I highlight that information asymmetry is a key friction, but it's challenging to maybe overcome it from policy design. So I don't have that much to say right now in this project about how we can improve information. Do we need to access maybe something like more big data type of solutions where we're using more soft information about the borrower, for example? But what I do clearly highlight is that if we're going to subsidize institutions, maybe reduce their transaction costs, or we're going to prescribe a level of aid to give to borrowers, these two approaches that are very policy actionable are going to be contaminated by information asymmetry. Okay, so if there's a big information asymmetry problem, subsidies will be extremely large in order to actually meaningfully prevent foreclosures. And then if we want to say, okay, being more generous in relief is going to help more borrowers, if the information asymmetry is there, actually being more generous creates more incentive for strategic behavior on the borrower side, and financial institutions respond in kind by becoming more hesitant because now they're facing a more adversely selected pool from their perspective. Okay, so I think there are many really interesting directions to keep pushing this project and kind of my research agenda in a way that relates to today's kind of session, and thinking really about relief's effect on the long-term borrower composition, thinking about the trade-offs between speed of relief, and the accuracy of targeting that relief. This is particularly relevant in kind of the context of PPP loans in the United States coming out of COVID-19. And then there's still limited study on the kind of really why banks behave differently. I didn't show you a lot of graphics on this, but again, different banks treated borrowers very differently, even if they were observably the same income, the same home value. And knowing why that is really important because institutions are always the intermediaries in this sort of debt relief program. All right, thank you very much for having me, and happy to take questions in the kind of last part of this session.